In July 1985, Thomas and Daniel descended into calm Caribbean waters for what should have been a routine father-son dive. Neither would surface alive. For 14 years, their disappearance baffled investigators and tormented their family. Then, a discovery deep underwater revealed something far more disturbing than anyone imagined. What happened in those final moments beneath the surface? Why did experienced divers simply vanish? And what does the evidence found inside a massive grouper tell us about their fate? Before we begin, a quick like and subscribe is always appreciated. And please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The morning of July 18th, 1985, began like any other summer day in Key Largo, Florida. Thomas Mitchell, a 49-year-old marine biologist from Boston, had been planning this dive trip with his son Daniel for months. Daniel, 20 years old and freshly graduated from college, had grown up listening to his father's stories about the ocean's mysteries. The two shared more than blood. They shared a deep passion for the underwater world that had bonded them since Daniel was a child. Thomas had taught his son to dive when Daniel turned 12, and over the years, they had explored dozens of dive sites together along the eastern seaboard. This trip to the Florida Keys was meant to be special, a celebration of Daniel's graduation and the beginning of his own career in marine science. The weather forecast predicted perfect conditions, clear skies, calm seas, and visibility extending beyond 80 feet underwater. Everything seemed aligned for an unforgettable experience. Thomas wasn't just any recreational diver. With over 30 years of diving experience and more than 2,000 logged dives, he had explored some of the most challenging underwater environments in the world. He held advanced certifications in deep diving, wreck penetration, and cave diving. His colleagues at the Marine Biology Institute in Boston considered him one of the most safety-conscious divers they knew. Thomas had survived equipment failures, encountered aggressive marine life, and navigated treacherous currents without incident. He was the kind of diver who checked his gear 3 times before entering the water and never took unnecessary risks. Daniel, though younger and less experienced, had already completed over 100 dives under his father's careful supervision. He had earned his advanced open water certification 2 years earlier and had proven himself to be methodical and cautious, traits his father had instilled in him. Friends described Daniel as eager but never reckless, always deferring to his father's judgment when planning dives. The Mitchell family had no reason to worry when Thomas and Daniel set out that morning. The father and son had chosen Molasses Reef, one of the most popular dive sites in the Florida Keys. Located about 4 miles offshore, the reef system featured stunning coral formations, abundant marine life, and a maximum depth of around 40 feet, well within the comfort zone for both divers. Thomas had dove this exact site 3 times before and knew the layout intimately. The plan was straightforward: a morning dive lasting approximately 45 minutes, followed by a surface interval and a second, shallower dive in the afternoon. They would stay together throughout the dive, maintain visual contact at all times, and surface with at least 700 pounds per square inch of air remaining in their tanks. Thomas had filed their dive plan with the charter boat captain, Stephen Kowalski, a 35-year-old former Navy diver who operated a well-maintained vessel called the Reef Runner. Stephen kept meticulous records of every dive group he transported, noting entry times, expected return times, and any special concerns. Nothing about Thomas and Daniel's plan raised any red flags. The Reef Runner departed the Key Largo Marina at 8:30 that morning with 12 divers aboard, including Thomas and Daniel. The other passengers were a mix of tourists and local diving enthusiasts, most diving in buddy pairs. Stephen Kowalski had been running dive charters in the Keys for 7 years and prided himself on his safety record. He conducted a thorough briefing before the boat left the dock, reviewing emergency procedures, hand signals, and the location of safety equipment. The crossing to Molasses Reef took approximately 25 minutes, and the sea conditions were as predicted: gentle swells and virtually no wind. At 9:15, Stephen anchored the Reef Runner in 38 feet of water over a sandy patch adjacent to the reef. The other divers began entering the water in pairs, each group acknowledging Stephen with an OK signal before descending. Thomas and Daniel were the fourth pair to enter the water. Stephen watched as Thomas performed a final check of Daniel's equipment, then his own. Both men gave Stephen the OK signal, then disappeared beneath the surface at exactly 9:32. For the first 20 minutes underwater, nothing seemed unusual to the other divers exploring Molasses Reef that morning. Several divers later reported seeing Thomas and Daniel swimming together near the main coral ridge, approximately 150 feet from where the Reef Runner was anchored. Margaret Foster, a 42-year-old schoolteacher from Ohio diving with her husband Robert, recalled passing near the Mitchells around 9:50. She remembered noticing Thomas pointing out something to Daniel, perhaps a particular fish or coral formation. The Mitchells appeared relaxed and unhurried, swimming at a comfortable pace with plenty of distance between them and the reef to avoid accidental contact with the delicate corals. Robert Foster, an experienced underwater photographer, had briefly considered asking if he could photograph the father and son together, but decided against interrupting their dive. That decision would haunt him for years. By 10 o'clock, most of the dive groups were beginning to make their way back toward the boat, their air supplies depleting as expected. But no one saw Thomas and Daniel returning. Stephen Kowalski began to feel uneasy when the first 5 dive teams had surfaced and climbed back aboard the Reef Runner. But Thomas and Daniel had not appeared. He checked his watch, 10:20. The Mitchells had been underwater for 48 minutes, slightly longer than their planned 45-minute dive, but not yet cause for alarm. Many divers extended their bottom time by a few minutes if their air consumption was better than expected. Stephen scanned the water surface, looking for the telltale bubbles that would indicate divers below. He saw nothing in the vicinity where the Mitchells had descended. By 10:30, with all other divers accounted for and resting on the boat, Stephen's concern deepened. 58 minutes was pushing the limits of what 2 divers could safely manage on standard aluminum 80 tanks, even at the shallow depth of Molasses Reef. He asked the other divers if anyone had seen the Mitchells during the latter part of the dive. No one had encountered them after the Foster couple's sighting around 9:50. Stephen made a decision. He would wait 5 more minutes, then initiate search procedures. At 10:35, with still no sign of the Mitchells, Stephen Kowalski pulled up the anchor and began a systematic search pattern around the dive site. He instructed everyone aboard to watch the water carefully for any sign of surfacing divers, emergency flotation devices, or equipment. The Reef Runner moved slowly in expanding circles, covering the reef area and the surrounding sand channels. Stephen knew that currents in this area were generally mild, but even a slight current over the course of an hour could push divers several hundred yards from their entry point. After 20 minutes of searching from the boat with no results, Stephen radioed the Coast Guard station in Isla Morada. He reported 2 missing divers, provided their descriptions and last known position, and requested assistance. The Coast Guard dispatcher took down the information calmly and efficiently, then asked the question that made Stephen's stomach drop. How much air did they have? Stephen explained they had been diving with standard aluminum 80 tanks filled to 3,000 pounds per square inch, based on their planned profile, and now over 70 minutes underwater. They would have run out of air at least 10 minutes ago, possibly longer, depending on their consumption rates and any exertion. Within 15 minutes of Stephen's call, a Coast Guard helicopter was airborne from Isla Morada, heading toward the coordinates of Molasses Reef. 2 Coast Guard patrol boats also departed, one from Key Largo and another from Marathon. The helicopter arrived first, at approximately 11:15, and began an aerial search pattern covering a 2-mile radius around the last known position. From 300 feet above the crystal clear water, the crew could see the reef formations clearly, along with the scattered boats of other divers and fishermen in the area. They saw no sign of divers in distress, no emergency flotation devices, and no bodies floating on the surface. The patrol boats arrived by 11:40 and began a coordinated surface search, while Stephen and the reef runner continued their own search pattern. Other dive boats in the area, hearing the Coast Guard radio traffic, volunteered to assist. By noon, 6 boats were searching the waters around Molasses Reef, with crews scanning every inch of visible ocean. The helicopter made multiple passes at different altitudes, the crew straining their eyes for any clue. As the afternoon wore on with no sign of Thomas and Daniel Mitchell, the search expanded. The Coast Guard calculated potential drift patterns based on the mild current that had been flowing south-southeast that morning at approximately half a knot. This meant that if the divers had surfaced and were unable to signal for help, they could have drifted as much as 3 miles from Molasses Reef over the course of several hours. The helicopter extended its search radius to 5 miles, flying grid patterns to ensure complete coverage. Additional patrol boats joined the effort, and the Coast Guard issued a marine broadcast asking all vessels in the area to watch for any sign of the missing divers. Sport fishermen, cruise boats, and other dive charters all reported back negative sightings. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, more than 30 vessels and 2 helicopters had participated in the search, covering over 50 square miles of ocean. Stephen Kowalski remained on the water, refusing to return to shore until darkness forced him back. His hands shook as he gripped the wheel of the reef runner, replaying every moment of the morning in his mind. The following morning, July 19th, the Coast Guard organized underwater search teams to explore Molasses Reef itself and the surrounding areas. 4 Navy divers from the Key West Naval Air Station joined the effort, along with 6 experienced local dive masters who knew the reef system intimately. The teams divided the area into sectors and conducted methodical searches, swimming in careful patterns to ensure they missed nothing. The underwater visibility remained excellent, allowing the divers to see clearly across the reef structures and into the sand channels between coral heads. They searched caves, crevices, and overhangs where disoriented divers might have become trapped. They looked for any sign of equipment: tanks, masks, fins, weight belts, anything that might provide a clue to what had happened. The search teams found nothing, not a single piece of equipment belonging to Thomas or Daniel Mitchell. It was as if the two men had simply vanished into the ocean without leaving a trace. By the afternoon of the second day, the underwater search teams had covered every inch of Molasses Reef and extended their search to adjacent reef systems. Still nothing. In Boston, Patricia Mitchell received the phone call that every diver's spouse dreads. A Coast Guard officer, speaking in a carefully controlled voice, informed her that her husband Thomas and son Daniel had failed to surface from a dive in the Florida Keys. Search efforts were ongoing, he assured her, but she should prepare to travel to Florida. Patricia, a 51-year-old high school English teacher, felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She had always supported her husband's and son's passion for diving, even though she herself had never felt comfortable underwater. She had kissed them both goodbye 3 days earlier when they left for Florida, telling them to be safe and take pictures. Now she was being told they were missing. Patricia immediately called her daughter, Jennifer, a 23-year-old medical student in New York. Together, they booked flights to Miami and arrived in Key Largo that evening. At the Coast Guard station, they met with Commander Richard Holloway, who briefed them on the search efforts with compassionate honesty. He explained that the search had been extensive and would continue, but he also had to prepare them for difficult possibilities. As the search entered its third day, with no results, Coast Guard investigators began considering various scenarios that might explain the disappearance. The most straightforward explanation was that something had gone catastrophically wrong underwater, causing both divers to drown, and that their bodies had been carried away by currents before they could be located. However, several facts made this theory problematic. First, Thomas and Daniel were both experienced divers who understood emergency procedures. Even if one diver had experienced a problem, the other should have been able to assist and, if necessary, surface alone to get help. Second, the current that morning had been mild, not strong enough to divert experienced divers significantly off course or to rapidly carry bodies away from the search area. Third, no equipment had been found. Even if the bodies had been swept away, tanks, weight belts, masks, and fins should have been somewhere on the reef or nearby. Commander Holloway assigned Lieutenant Angela Torres, a 32-year-old investigator with dive accident experience, to interview all the divers who had been on the reef runner that morning. Lieutenant Torres conducted detailed interviews with each of the 10 divers who had been on the boat with Thomas and Daniel that morning. She took careful notes as each person recounted their observations. Margaret and Robert Foster repeated their account of seeing the Mitchells around 9:50, swimming together near the main coral ridge. They both emphasized that nothing had seemed wrong or unusual about the pair. David Chen, a 28-year-old computer programmer from California, recalled seeing the Mitchells earlier in the dive, around 9:40, and noted that both had appeared to be checking their air gauges, a standard procedure. Susan and James Patterson, a retired couple from Virginia, mentioned that they had been diving near the anchor line and had seen numerous divers throughout their 40-minute dive, but couldn't specifically remember seeing the Mitchells. None of the witnesses reported seeing any signs of distress, any unusual marine life in the area, or any dangerous conditions. The water had been calm, visibility had been excellent, and the reef had been free of any obvious hazards. Torres found herself with more questions than answers. Stephen Kowalski, still shaken by the disappearance, provided Torres with detailed information about the equipment the Mitchells had been using. Both had been diving with aluminum 80 cubic foot tanks filled to 3,000 pounds per square inch. Thomas had been using his personal regulator, a high-quality model he had maintained meticulously for years. Daniel had been using a rental regulator from Stephen's shop, one that had been serviced just 2 weeks earlier and had been used without incident on dozens of dives since. Both divers had worn standard buoyancy control devices, adequate weight for their body types and equipment configuration, and full-length wetsuits appropriate for the water temperature of 82 degrees. Stephen explained that he had visually inspected their equipment during his pre-dive briefing and had seen nothing that concerned him. Both men had carried standard depth gauges, dive computers, and compasses. Thomas had also been carrying an underwater slate for taking notes, a habit from his scientific work. None of this equipment had been recovered. Torres made note of every detail, hoping that some clue would emerge from the technical specifications. One aspect of the investigation particularly troubled Lieutenant Torres. Modern dive computers, which both Thomas and Daniel had been wearing, were designed to record depth, time, and other data throughout a dive. If the computers could be recovered, they would provide a precise record of the diver's movements underwater. More importantly, dive computers in 1985 were substantial pieces of equipment, often worn on the wrist or console, and were buoyant enough that they should have eventually surfaced if separated from a diver. The fact that neither computer had been found suggested that they were either still attached to the divers, wherever they were, or had been carried far from the search area by currents that no one believed were strong enough to do so. Torres consulted with marine current experts from the University of Miami, who confirmed that the tidal and ocean currents in the area that day should not have been capable of moving objects more than a few miles at most. Yet the expanded search covering 8 miles in all directions from Molasses Reef had found nothing. It didn't make sense, and Torres knew it. By the 4th day of the search, the story of the missing father and son had attracted significant media attention. Local news stations in Miami and throughout Florida covered the story extensively, and national networks picked it up as well. The image of an experienced marine biologist and his recently graduated son vanishing without a trace during what should have been a routine dive captured public imagination and concern. Television crews arrived in Key Largo, filming stand-ups with the marina and the ocean in the background. Reporters interviewed Stephen Kowalski, who appeared exhausted and guilt-ridden despite having followed all proper procedures. Patricia and Jennifer Mitchell, staying at a hotel in Key Largo and waiting desperately for news, agreed to a brief press conference at the urging of the Coast Guard, who hoped that media coverage might lead to new information. Patricia, her voice barely above a whisper, pleaded for anyone who might have seen anything unusual that day to come forward. Jennifer, standing beside her mother, struggled to hold back tears as cameras flashed. The broadcast reached millions of viewers across the country. In the days following the media coverage, the Coast Guard received dozens of tips from people claiming to have information about the missing divers. Most were well-intentioned, but ultimately unhelpful. A fisherman reported seeing 2 divers surface near Isla Morada around 11 o'clock on the day of the disappearance. But investigation revealed those had been different divers from a different charter. A tourist claimed to have found a dive mask on a beach in Marathon, but the mask didn't match the description of equipment the Mitchells had been using. A boat captain reported seeing what he thought might be bodies floating 20 miles offshore 2 days after the disappearance, but a Coast Guard helicopter investigated and found only debris from a damaged fishing net. Each lead required investigation, each took time and resources, and each ended in disappointment. Lieutenant Torres followed up on every single report, no matter how unlikely it seemed. She was looking for the one detail that might break the case open. But as the days turned into a week with no solid leads, she had to acknowledge what Commander Holloway had already concluded: Thomas and Daniel Mitchell were gone. On July 26th, 8 days after the disappearance, the Coast Guard officially suspended the active search for Thomas and Daniel Mitchell. Commander Holloway made the announcement at a somber press conference, explaining that search teams had covered over 300 square miles of ocean, conducted extensive underwater surveys of all nearby reef systems, and followed up on every credible lead. In the absence of any evidence or new information, continuing the active search was no longer justifiable given the resources required. However, Holloway emphasized that the case remained open and that all mariners in the area had been asked to remain vigilant for any sign of the missing divers. He expressed his deep sympathy to the Mitchell family and his frustration that the search had not produced answers. Patricia Mitchell, who had remained in Key Largo throughout the search, sat in the back of the room during the announcement, her face a mask of grief and disbelief. Jennifer stood beside her mother, one arm around her shoulders. For the Mitchell family, the nightmare was not ending. It was entering a new phase of uncertainty. Returning to Boston without her husband and son was perhaps the most difficult thing Patricia Mitchell had ever done. There had been no bodies to bury, no funeral to arrange, no closure of any kind. Thomas and Daniel had simply vanished, and their family was left in a terrible limbo. Friends and colleagues from the Marine Biology Institute held a memorial service for Thomas and Daniel in late August, a somber gathering where speakers shared memories and tried to make sense of the senseless. Patricia listened as Thomas's colleagues praised his contributions to marine science, his dedication to his students, and his passion for ocean conservation. She heard Daniel's college friends talk about his ambition, his kindness, and his excitement about following in his father's footsteps. But none of it brought answers, and none of it brought them back. In the weeks and months that followed, Patricia found herself trapped in a painful cycle. Some days she convinced herself that somehow Thomas and Daniel were still alive, that they would eventually be found. Other days she forced herself to accept that they were gone, that she was now a widow and had lost a son. Jennifer Mitchell could not accept the lack of answers. After returning to medical school in New York, she found herself unable to concentrate on her studies. She spent hours in the library, researching diving accidents, ocean currents, and marine phenomena. She called Lieutenant Torres weekly, asking if there had been any new developments, any new leads. Torres, sympathetic to the family's suffering, always took Jennifer's calls and patiently explained that nothing new had emerged. But Jennifer wouldn't stop looking. She contacted diving experts around the country, asking them to review the case details and offer theories. She corresponded with oceanographers about unusual current patterns. She even hired a private investigator, spending nearly $3,000 of her student loan money to conduct an independent review of the case. The investigator, a former police detective named Harold Simmons, spent 2 weeks in the Florida Keys interviewing witnesses, reviewing Coast Guard reports, and diving at Molasses Reef himself. His conclusion was the same as the official investigation. The disappearance was inexplicable, and without new evidence, it would likely remain so. Jennifer felt defeated but not deterred. She would keep searching. Years went by with no new information about the fate of Thomas and Daniel Mitchell. Patricia eventually returned to teaching, throwing herself into her work as a way to cope with the loss. She never remarried, and she kept Thomas's study exactly as he had left it, his books and research papers gathering dust on the shelves. Jennifer eventually completed medical school and became a physician, specializing in emergency medicine. She often wondered if her career choice had been influenced by the helplessness she had felt when her father and brother vanished. Stephen Kowalski continued operating the Reef Runner, but the disappearance haunted him. He became even more cautious with his dive charters, sometimes to the point of being overly restrictive. He installed additional safety equipment on his boat and required all divers to carry surface marker buoys. Every year on July 18th, Stephen made a solo trip to Molasses Reef and left a wreath in the water, a private memorial for the 2 men he had taken diving that terrible morning. Lieutenant Torres left the Coast Guard in 1989 and became a civilian diving safety consultant, but she never forgot the Mitchell case. It remained the only investigation she had been unable to solve. Over the years, other diving accidents and disappearances occurred in the Florida Keys, as they inevitably do in such a popular diving destination, but none quite matched the mysterious circumstances of the Mitchell case. In most accidents, evidence was found quickly: bodies, equipment, or witnesses who could explain what went wrong. The complete absence of any trace of Thomas and Daniel remained unusual. Diving safety experts occasionally referenced the Mitchell case in training materials as an example of how even experienced divers could vanish without explanation, though this provided little comfort to anyone. The case also became something of an urban legend among the diving community in South Florida. Some divers claimed that Molasses Reef was cursed, though experienced locals dismissed such talk as superstition. Others speculated wildly about what might have happened: encounters with sharks, abduction by submarines, even alien involvement. Lieutenant Torres, when she heard such speculation, would firmly redirect the conversation to facts. The truth was that no one knew what had happened, and wild theories didn't help anyone, especially the Mitchell family. But human nature demands explanations, even when none exist. 14 years after Thomas and Daniel Mitchell vanished, the case had largely faded from public memory. Patricia was 65 years old, retired from teaching, and living quietly in the same Boston house where she had raised her children. Jennifer was 37, married to another physician, and living in Philadelphia with 2 young children of her own. The pain of losing Thomas and Daniel had not disappeared, but it had been absorbed into the fabric of their lives, a permanent sadness they had learned to carry. Neither Patricia nor Jennifer dove, and neither visited the ocean if they could avoid it. The salt water held too many painful associations. In Key Largo, Stephen Kowalski was still operating the Reef Runner, now 50 years old and graying at the temples. He still made his annual memorial trip to Molasses Reef every July 18th, still wondering what had happened to the two men he had taken diving so long ago, and Lieutenant Angela Torres, now working as a consultant and instructor in diving safety, still occasionally pulled out her notes from the Mitchell investigation, reviewing them as if some new insight might suddenly appear. Then, in October of 1999, something did. Commercial fisherman Raymond Walsh was working his regular route approximately 8 miles southeast of Key Largo when he hauled in something unusual. Raymond, a 43-year-old native of the Keys who had been fishing these waters for 25 years, knew immediately that the massive grouper tangled in his net was remarkable. The fish was huge, easily over 300 pounds, and appeared to be a Goliath grouper, a species that could grow to enormous sizes. Goliath groupers were protected in 1999, so Raymond knew he would have to release the fish. But first he wanted to ensure it was healthy and uninjured. As he worked to free the grouper from the net, something about the fish's behavior struck him as odd. Its jaw seemed distended, as if something was lodged in its mouth or throat. Raymond had seen fish with various objects stuck in their mouths before: hooks, pieces of debris, even smaller fish they had attempted to swallow. But this seemed different. The grouper was struggling more than Raymond would have expected for a fish of its size and apparent health. Curious and concerned that the fish might die if something was obstructing its breathing, Raymond made a decision that would finally answer a 14-year-old question. Using a fish billy, a short club used to humanly dispatch fish, Raymond carefully stunned the massive grouper enough to work on it, safely without harming it permanently. He pried open the enormous mouth, which easily could have accommodated a basketball, and reached inside to dislodge whatever was causing the obstruction. His fingers touched something hard and smooth, nothing like the texture of marine life. Raymond pulled, and slowly, impossibly, a human skull emerged from the grouper's mouth. Raymond dropped the skull into his boat with a shout of shock and stumbled backward, nearly falling overboard. The grouper, freed of its burden, thrashed once and slipped back into the water, disappearing into the depths. Raymond stood in his boat, staring at the skull on the deck, his heart pounding. The skull was clearly human, weathered by years underwater but still intact. Fragments of what might have been tissue or other organic matter clung to it. Raymond immediately grabbed his radio and called the Coast Guard, his voice shaking as he reported what he had found. Within an hour, a Coast Guard patrol boat had arrived at his position, and officers carefully secured the skull as evidence. The skull was transported to the Miami-Dade County Medical Examiner's Office, where forensic anthropologist Dr. Elizabeth Huang began the careful process of analysis. Dr. Huang, a 41-year-old expert in skeletal remains, had examined hundreds of bones recovered from various circumstances, but even she found this case unusual. The skull had been underwater for an extended period, clearly years rather than months. Marine organisms had colonized portions of the bone, and the surface showed signs of biological and chemical weathering, consistent with long-term submersion in salt water. However, the skull was remarkably complete, with no major fractures or obvious trauma that would indicate cause of death. Dr. Huang carefully cleaned the skull, photographed it from multiple angles, and began taking measurements. Based on the size, structure, and specific anatomical features, she determined the skull belonged to a young adult male, probably between 18 and 25 years old at the time of death. The dental work visible in the upper and lower jaws would be crucial for identification. Dr. Huang prepared a detailed report and forwarded it to the Coast Guard Investigative Division, now headed by Commander Michael Barrett. Commander Barrett, reading Dr. Huang's report, immediately thought of the numerous unsolved cases involving missing divers and boaters in the Florida Keys over the past decades. He assigned an investigator to pull dental records for every young male who had gone missing in South Florida waters over the past 20 years. The list was distressingly long. The ocean claimed its share of victims, and not all were ever found or identified. The investigator, Lieutenant James Morrison, methodically requested dental records from families and dentists across the state and beyond. When the dental records for Daniel Mitchell arrived from Boston, forwarded by a dental practice that had maintained them even after Daniel's disappearance 14 years earlier, Morrison compared them to Dr. Huang's photographs and X-rays of the skull. The match was unmistakable. The distinctive pattern of fillings, the slight crowding of the lower front teeth, the wisdom teeth that had been removed just a year before Daniel's death, every detail aligned perfectly. Morrison immediately contacted Commander Barrett with the news. After 14 years, Daniel Mitchell had been found, but the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. Where had the skull been for 14 years? How had it ended up inside a massive grouper? And most importantly, where was the rest of Daniel's body? And where was his father? Commander Barrett personally called Patricia Mitchell in Boston to inform her of the discovery. It was not a conversation he would ever forget. Patricia, hearing that her son had been found after 14 years, experienced a flood of emotions she couldn't fully process. Relief that there was finally some physical evidence, some confirmation of what had happened, horror at the nature of the discovery, and renewed grief as fresh as the day she had first learned of the disappearance. Barrett gently explained that only Daniel's skull had been recovered so far, and that there was no sign of Thomas. He also explained the unusual circumstances of the discovery inside the mouth of a large grouper, and acknowledged that this raised questions about what had happened to Daniel's remains over the years. Patricia, struggling to speak, asked the question that everyone was wondering. Had Daniel been alive when the grouper found him, or had the fish scavenged his remains after death? Barrett assured her that based on all evidence, Daniel had almost certainly died during the original diving incident 14 years ago, and that his remains had been in the ocean since then. The grouper had likely found and consumed parts of the remains over time. It was a disturbing image, but it was the truth. When Patricia called Jennifer to tell her about the discovery, Jennifer experienced a moment of surreal disconnection from reality. For 14 years, she had imagined various scenarios of what might have happened to her father and brother. She had pictured them drowning, imagined them trapped in some underwater cave or crevice, even allowed herself brief fantasies that they had somehow survived and would one day return. But she had never imagined this: her brother's skull carried in the mouth of a massive fish for years, moving through the ocean until a fisherman's net had finally brought it back to the surface. Jennifer immediately took time off from her work at the hospital and traveled to Boston to be with her mother. The two women sat together, trying to process this bizarre development. Jennifer, with her medical training, understood the forensic explanation of what had likely happened. Daniel's body had decomposed in the ocean over the years. Bones had separated, and scavenging fish had consumed or dispersed the remains. Groupers, she learned from her own research, were known to consume a wide variety of organic material and had massive mouths capable of engulfing large prey. But understanding the science didn't make the reality any easier to accept. The discovery of Daniel's skull prompted the Coast Guard to reopen the Mitchell case formally. Commander Barrett assigned a team to review all the original evidence, re-interview witnesses who could still be located, and search archives for any information that might have been overlooked 14 years earlier. Lieutenant Morrison contacted Stephen Kowalski, who was shocked to learn about the discovery and immediately volunteered to assist the investigation in any way possible. Morrison also reached out to Angela Torres, the original investigator, who was now working as a consultant in California. Torres immediately flew to Florida at her own expense to participate in the renewed investigation. She brought her original notes, preserved meticulously over the years, and sat down with Barrett and Morrison to review every detail. The key question now was whether the location where Raymond Walsh had found the grouper, 8 miles southeast of Molasses Reef, provided any new insight into what had happened on that day in July 1985. Torres pulled out navigation charts and began plotting possibilities. The distance and direction were consistent with current patterns, suggesting that Daniel's remains could have drifted or been carried to that area over time. Marine biologists consulted by the investigation explained that Goliath groupers typically have relatively small home ranges, often staying within a few miles of a particular reef or structure that they claim as territory. However, the fish can live for several decades and do occasionally move between locations, especially if food sources change or if they are disturbed by environmental factors. The grouper that Raymond Walsh had caught was estimated to be between 30 and 40 years old based on its size, meaning it would have been a young adult around the time of the Mitchells' disappearance. The biologists theorized that the grouper had likely encountered Daniel's remains somewhere in the area of the original dive site or along the drift path from that site. Whether the grouper had consumed the skull immediately after Daniel's death or had found it later as scattered remains was impossible to determine. One marine biologist, Dr. Sarah Clemens from the University of Miami, noted that groupers have been known to carry objects in their mouths for extended periods without swallowing them completely, sometimes using rocks or shells to crush the shells of prey. It was possible, though unusual, that the grouper had been carrying Daniel's skull for years. With Daniel's remains partially located, the investigation focused on trying to find any other evidence, particularly the diving equipment that both Thomas and Daniel had been using. If their tanks, buoyancy control devices, or other equipment could be found, they might provide crucial information about what had gone wrong. The Coast Guard organized a series of dives in the area where Raymond Walsh had caught the grouper, using side-scan sonar to search the ocean floor for any metallic objects. The search covered a grid pattern extending 2 miles in each direction from Walsh's coordinates. Diving teams investigated several promising sonar contacts, but most turned out to be debris from boats, discarded anchors, or natural rock formations. After 3 weeks of intensive searching, the teams had found no equipment belonging to the Mitchells. Morrison expanded the search to include the entire drift path from Molasses Reef to the Discovery location. But the area was vast and the ocean floor was complex, with numerous holes, crevices, and coral formations where equipment could be hidden. The search was eventually suspended when it became clear that finding small objects in such a large area was nearly impossible. The ocean was keeping its secrets. With the discovery of Daniel's skull, but little other new evidence, investigators revisited the theories that had been proposed 14 years earlier. The leading theory had always been that something had gone catastrophically wrong during the dive, causing both men to die underwater. But what could cause two experienced divers to both perish without either one surfacing or leaving behind equipment? Angela Torres worked with Commander Barrett to examine several scenarios. Medical emergency was one possibility. Thomas could have suffered a heart attack or stroke underwater, and Daniel, attempting to rescue his father, could have run out of air or become disoriented. Equipment failure affecting both divers simultaneously seemed unlikely, but not impossible. Atoxic gas contamination in their tanks could have rendered them unconscious, though the tanks had been filled at a reputable facility that had never had such problems. The new piece of information, the location where Daniel's skull was found, suggested that the bodies had drifted or been carried southeast from Molasses Reef over time. But this didn't explain why no equipment had surfaced or been found. Tanks, even when empty, have buoyancy characteristics that typically bring them to the surface unless they're trapped. Something didn't add up. Lieutenant Morrison, studying navigation charts and bathymetric data, noticed something that had not been fully explored in the original investigation. While Molasses Reef itself sat in relatively shallow water of 35 to 40 feet, the area southeast of the reef, the direction where Daniel's skull had been found, included several deeper channels and drop-offs. Approximately 3 miles southeast of Molasses Reef, the ocean floor dropped from 40 feet to over 120 feet in what was known as the Hawk Channel. Beyond that, the continental shelf descended even more dramatically. Morrison theorized that if the divers had somehow drifted off the reef, perhaps disoriented or in distress, they could have found themselves over much deeper water. At greater depth, air consumption increases dramatically, and nitrogen narcosis can impair judgment. If Thomas and Daniel had inadvertently descended into deeper water, they could have experienced a cascade of problems that overwhelmed them despite their experience. Torres found this theory plausible but troubling. For both divers to lose track of their depth so dramatically would require a level of disorientation or distraction that seemed inconsistent with their known caution and experience, unless something had happened to impair their judgment from the very beginning of the dive. One aspect of the case that had always bothered Torres was the assumption that the tanks had been properly filled and analyzed. Standard practice in 1985 required dive shops to fill tanks with compressed air filtered to remove contaminants, but testing protocols were not as rigorous as they would later become. Torres requested that investigators track down records from the dive shop where Thomas and Daniel had gotten their tanks filled the morning of the dive. The shop, Islandevers, was still in operation under new ownership. The new owner cooperated fully, providing access to old logbooks and maintenance records. The records showed that tanks numbered 73 and 88 had been signed out to the Reef Runner for Stephen Kowalski's charter on July 18, 1985. Those tanks had been filled from the shop's compressor bank the previous evening. The compressor maintenance log showed that the filters had been changed 3 weeks earlier, well within the recommended service interval. There was no indication of any problem with the air supply. However, Torres noted that the shop had no records of actually testing the air quality in those specific tanks. They had simply assumed the air was good because the compressor was functioning properly. It was a small detail, but it represented a gap in the chain of evidence. Morrison compiled a list of all other diver disappearances in the Florida Keys over the past 20 years to see if any patterns emerged. He found 14 cases where divers had gone missing and were never found. Of those, 9 were solo divers, which made their disappearances easier to understand. A solo diver who experiences a problem has nobody to assist or report what happened. Of the remaining 5 cases involving buddy teams or groups, 4 had occurred in much deeper water or in overhead environments like caves and wrecks, where entrapment was a realistic possibility. The Mitchell case remained unique. Experienced divers, diving together at a shallow depth in open water, vanishing without a trace. Morrison did notice one other interesting case from 1992. A diver named Carl Henderson had disappeared while diving alone off Marathon, approximately 25 miles from where the Mitchells had vanished. Henderson's tank had been found 3 months later, but his body never was. The tank analysis had revealed nothing unusual. Morrison contacted Henderson's family and learned that Carl had been an experienced diver, though not as accomplished as Thomas Mitchell. The cases didn't seem directly related, but they illustrated how the ocean could swallow people with terrifying efficiency. For Patricia Mitchell, the discovery of Daniel's skull brought a measure of closure she had not expected. She now knew with certainty that Daniel was dead, ending 14 years of painful uncertainty. She arranged for the skull to be returned to Boston after forensic analysis was complete, and she buried it in a cemetery plot she had purchased years earlier, next to an empty grave marked with Thomas's name. The funeral was small, attended by Patricia, Jennifer's family, and a few close friends who had known Daniel. The pastor spoke about the mystery of life and death, about the ocean's power, and about a son's love for his father. Patricia wept quietly, finally able to mourn properly after years of suspended grief. After the funeral, she told Jennifer that she felt Daniel would have wanted to be in the ocean, not buried in the ground, but that she needed something physical to visit, a place to bring flowers and remember her son. Jennifer understood completely. She had brought her own children to the service, wanting them to know about the uncle they would never meet. Patricia looked at her grandchildren and felt both gratitude for their presence and deep sadness that Thomas would never know them, that Daniel would never have children of his own. Life continued, but the losses left permanent holes. In December of 1999, 2 months after the discovery of Daniel's skull, Stephen Kowalski contacted Commander Barrett and asked to meet privately. Barrett agreed, and they met at a quiet diner in Key Largo. Stephen, now visibly aged beyond his 50 years, told Barrett something he had never shared with anyone. On the morning of July 18, 1985, Stephen had been distracted and not functioning at his best. His wife had asked him for a divorce the night before, and he had barely slept. During the pre-dive briefing, he had gone through the motions, but had not been as attentive as he normally was. When Thomas and Daniel had entered the water, Stephen had not watched them as carefully as he should have. In fact, he admitted, he couldn't actually remember seeing them surface after their entry to confirm they were okay before beginning their descent. It was a standard safety check, and he normally never skipped it. But that morning his mind had been elsewhere. Stephen had carried this guilt for 14 years, wondering if his distraction had somehow contributed to the tragedy. Barrett listened carefully, then assured Stephen that nothing in his confession changed the investigation's conclusions. Even if Stephen had watched the Mitchells more carefully during their entry, it wouldn't have prevented whatever happened to them underwater. Stephen nodded, but said he needed to confess anyway, needed someone official to know. As part of the renewed investigation, Lieutenant Morrison contacted the manufacturers of the diving equipment that Thomas and Daniel had been using. The Regulator Company, which had since been acquired by a larger corporation, provided technical specifications and failure rate data for the model that Thomas had owned. The data showed that the Regulator had an excellent safety record, with only 3 reported failures out of approximately 50,000 units sold over a 10-year period. None of those failures had resulted in fatalities, as divers had simply switched to their backup regulators and surfaced safely. The company that manufactured Daniel's rental regulator, a different brand, provided similar information showing reliable performance. The buoyancy control device manufacturer noted that their devices had redundant inflation systems and that complete failure of both systems simultaneously would be extremely rare. Morrison also researched dive computer failures and found that while computers could malfunction, they typically failed by shutting off or displaying error messages, not by providing dangerously incorrect information. The technical analysis suggested that simultaneous equipment failure affecting both divers was highly improbable. Yet something had gone terribly wrong. Morrison found himself agreeing with Torres's assessment from 14 years earlier. The Mitchell case defied simple explanation. The ocean had taken 2 men and revealed only the smallest fragment of the truth. In early 2000, a documentary filmmaker named Rebecca Shaw approached Patricia and Jennifer Mitchell about creating a film about the case. Rebecca, a 35-year-old independent filmmaker who specialized in unsolved mysteries, believed the Mitchell story deserved to be told comprehensively. She promised to handle the subject with sensitivity and to focus on the human story as much as the mystery. After considerable discussion, Patricia and Jennifer agreed to participate, hoping that renewed public attention might somehow generate new leads or information. Rebecca spent 6 months researching and filming, interviewing everyone connected to the case who would speak with her. She interviewed Stephen Kowalski, who appeared on camera for the first time and discussed his guilt and questions. She spoke with Angela Torres, who walked through her investigation and theories. She interviewed Raymond Walsh, who described finding the skull and his shock at the discovery. She dove at Molasses Reef with underwater cameras, showing viewers the peaceful beauty of the location where tragedy had struck. The documentary, titled Into Blue Silence, The Mitchell Mystery, premiered on a cable network in November 2000 and was watched by nearly 2 million viewers. The response was immediate. The network received hundreds of calls and emails from viewers offering theories, sympathy, and occasionally new information that had to be investigated. One of the most intriguing responses to the documentary came from a retired fisherman named Arthur Donnelly, who lived in Key West. Arthur, 72 years old and battling emphysema, contacted the production company to say he believed he had seen something relevant on the day the Mitchells disappeared, but had never come forward because he didn't think it was important at the time. Commander Barrett traveled to Key West to interview Arthur personally. The old fisherman explained that on July 18, 1985, he had been fishing from his boat approximately 5 miles south of Molasses Reef around mid-morning. He had noticed a large boat, much bigger than typical recreational or charter vessels, anchored in the area. The boat had looked official, possibly military or research-related, though Arthur couldn't remember specific details. What had stuck in his memory was that divers from this boat had been in the water, and they seemed to be conducting some kind of survey or operation. Arthur had thought nothing of it at the time. Military and research vessels often operated in the area. But after seeing the documentary and learning that civilian divers had vanished that same morning not far away, he wondered if there could be a connection. Barrett took careful notes, but was skeptical. Many boats operated in those waters, and the presence of one 5 miles from the dive site didn't necessarily mean anything. Despite his skepticism, Commander Barrett felt obligated to follow up on Arthur Donnelly's tip. He submitted requests to the Navy and Coast Guard for records of any official vessels that had been operating in the Key Largo area on July 18, 1985. The response took several weeks, but eventually Barrett received confirmation that a Navy research vessel, the USS Researcher, had been conducting sonar mapping operations in the area south of Key Largo on that date. The vessel had been part of an ongoing project to update navigational charts and had been in the area for 3 days. Barrett contacted the Navy directly and was eventually connected with retired Commander Philip Marsden, who had been the project officer for that mapping mission. Marsden, now 68 years old and living in Virginia, confirmed that the researcher had been in the area, but insisted that the operation had been routine and had nothing to do with the missing divers. The Navy diving team had been deploying and retrieving sonar equipment, but had not encountered any civilian divers or witnessed any incidents. Marsden provided the ship's log from that date, which showed no unusual events. Barrett thanked him and filed the information, noting that it seemed to be merely a coincidence. But he couldn't entirely dismiss the timing of the Navy presence. Dr. Helen Portman, an oceanographer from Florida Atlantic University, reviewed the current data from July 18, 1985 at Commander Barrett's request, using historical data from tide stations and current meters. She reconstructed the water movement patterns that had existed on that day. Her analysis confirmed what investigators had believed 14 years earlier. The prevailing current had been flowing southeast at approximately half a knot, mild enough that experienced divers should have been able to navigate against it without difficulty. However, Dr. Portman noted something interesting in her analysis. On the day in question, a spring tide had been occurring, meaning the tidal range was larger than normal. While the surface current had been mild, there could have been stronger currents at depth, particularly near channels and drop-offs where water funneled through restricted areas. If Thomas and Daniel had drifted off the reef into one of these channels, they might have encountered currents substantially stronger than what existed at the main dive site. Dr. Portman emphasized that this was speculative. She had no direct measurements of currents in those specific locations on that specific day, but it was plausible. Barrett added this information to the growing file, another piece of the puzzle that might explain part of what happened, but still left the central mystery unsolved. Jennifer Mitchell, now deeply involved in researching her father and brother's disappearance, developed her own theory about what might have happened. With her medical background, she focused on the human factors that could have contributed to the tragedy. She researched nitrogen narcosis, a condition where the narcotic effect of nitrogen under pressure impairs judgment and coordination, essentially causing divers to act drunk underwater. While nitrogen narcosis typically affects divers at depths below 70 feet, Jennifer learned that individual susceptibility varies and that factors like fatigue, stress, cold water, and even alcohol consumption beforehand can make divers more vulnerable at shallower depths. She wondered if both her father and brother had been affected by mild narcosis, perhaps exacerbated by some other factor, leading them to make poor decisions. Perhaps they had descended deeper than intended, chasing after some interesting fish or exploring a crevice, and had become progressively more impaired. She shared her theory with Commander Barrett, who acknowledged it was possible but noted that it didn't explain why no equipment had been found. Jennifer had no answer for that, but she felt that nitrogen narcosis explained the loss of situational awareness better than other theories. She wrote her theory in a detailed letter and placed it in a file with all her other research, hoping that someday it might help solve the mystery. In March 2001, 16 years after the original disappearance, sport diver Michelle Rodriguez made a discovery that reignited the investigation. Michelle, a 32-year-old dive instructor from Miami, was conducting a training dive with students at a site called Conch Reef, approximately 12 miles southeast of where the Mitchells had vanished and 4 miles from where Raymond Walsh had found Daniel's skull. At a depth of 55 feet, Michelle noticed something white lodged in a crevice in the reef. Investigating closer, she realized with shock that it was another human skull. Michelle immediately surfaced with her students, returned to her boat, and radioed the Coast Guard. A recovery team arrived within 2 hours and carefully extracted the skull from the crevice. The skull was transported to Dr. Elizabeth Huang at the medical examiner's office for analysis. Dr. Huang's examination revealed that this skull belonged to a male, older than the first, probably between 45 and 55 years old at the time of death. The skull showed similar weathering patterns to Daniel's, consistent with having been underwater for many years. The dental records comparison was conducted quickly this time. Within 2 days, the skull was positively identified as belonging to Thomas Mitchell. After 16 years, father and son had both been found, separated by 4 miles of ocean floor, but finally recovered. Patricia Mitchell was 81 years old when she received the call that Thomas's skull had been found. She had been living with the mystery for so long that the news felt almost surreal. Jennifer traveled from Philadelphia to Boston immediately, and together the two women made arrangements to bury Thomas beside Daniel in the cemetery plot that had been waiting all these years. The second funeral was even smaller than the first. Many of the people who had known Thomas were now elderly themselves or had passed away. But Patricia, Jennifer, and Jennifer's family stood beside the grave as the pastor spoke words of remembrance and release. Patricia placed a hand on each grave marker, one for each of the men she had loved and lost, and whispered a private goodbye. She told Jennifer afterward that she finally felt a sense of completeness, as painful as it was. Both Thomas and Daniel were home now, in a sense, no longer lost in the ocean's vastness. She could visit them, talk to them, and know where they were. It wasn't the ending she would have chosen, but it was an ending nonetheless. That night, Patricia sat in Thomas's study for the first time in years and allowed herself to cry fully, mourning not just for what she had lost, but for all the years of not knowing, all the years of hoping and despairing. Commander Barrett compiled a final report on the Mitchell case in May 2001. The report, running to over 300 pages, detailed every aspect of the investigation from the original disappearance through the recovery of both skulls. Barrett's conclusion was honest and unsatisfying. The exact cause of Thomas and Daniel Mitchell's deaths could not be determined with certainty. The physical evidence, 2 skulls recovered years after the fact, provided confirmation of death, but no insight into what had caused it. The most likely scenario, based on all available evidence, was that the divers had encountered some combination of problems that had overwhelmed them despite their experience. Possible contributing factors included stronger than expected currents, equipment malfunction that left no detectable trace, medical emergency affecting one or both divers, or disorientation leading to a dangerous descent into deeper water. Barrett noted that the complete absence of other remains or equipments suggested that the bodies had been dispersed by marine scavengers over many years, with the skulls being the only portions substantial enough to survive largely intact. He acknowledged that questions remained unanswered and likely would never be answered. "The ocean keeps its secrets," Barrett wrote, "and sometimes even the most thorough investigation cannot overcome that fundamental reality." The case was officially closed, but would remain in the records as unresolved. The Mitchell case became a reference point in diving safety training programs across the country. Instructors used it to emphasize that even experienced divers must remain vigilant, that the ocean is inherently unpredictable, and that diving always carries risk. The case also led to improved safety protocols. Many dive operators began requiring all divers to carry personal locator beacons or surface marker buoys with greater ballast to ensure they could be spotted from a distance if they surfaced away from their boat. Equipment manufacturers improved testing and quality control procedures. The diving community had learned from the tragedy, even if they never fully understood what had caused it. Stephen Kowalski, who continued operating the Reef Runner until his retirement in 2005, always included the Mitchell story in his safety briefings, not to frighten divers, but to encourage them to take every precaution seriously. Angela Torres incorporated the case into her consulting work, using it as an example of how investigations must follow every lead and question every assumption. For Patricia and Jennifer Mitchell, the legacy was more personal. They established a scholarship fund at the Marine Biology Institute in Thomas's name, supporting students pursuing ocean research. They wanted something positive to emerge from the tragedy, some way for Thomas and Daniel's passion for the ocean to continue benefiting others. More than 2 decades have passed since Thomas and Daniel Mitchell descended into the waters off Key Largo on that July morning in 1985. Their story has been told and retold, analyzed and theorized, but the central mystery endures. What happened in those moments beneath the surface that caused two experienced divers to vanish so completely? The ocean, having eventually returned their remains in fragments, carried by fish and hidden in reef crevices, has offered no clear answer. Perhaps there is comfort in knowing that father and son were together in those final moments, sharing a passion that had bonded them throughout Daniel's life. Perhaps there is some peace in the fact that they were lost doing something they loved, in an environment that had given them so much joy over the years. But for those who investigate such mysteries, for those who need explanations and closure, the Mitchell case remains frustratingly incomplete. The ocean holds countless secrets in its depths, stories of lives lost, and mysteries unsolved. Thomas and Daniel Mitchell became part of that eternal mystery, two more souls claimed by water that gives life and takes it with equal indifference. And somewhere in the depths off the Florida Keys, perhaps scattered across the ocean floor or long since absorbed back into the marine ecosystem, the rest of their story lies forever beyond our reach. This haunting tale of vanished divers reminds us why unsolved mysteries continue to grip our imagination. From cold cases that span decades to the relentless investigation seeking hidden truth, these stories of missing persons reflect the heartbreak families endure while searching for closure. The evidence discovered, the forensics examined, and the witnesses interviewed all become part of case files that define true crime storytelling. Whether through documentary formats or gripping tales shared across platforms, these mysteries remain never forgotten. The suspense, the clues, the dark secrets beneath the surface, they all contribute to our fascination with disappearances that leave us with more questions than answers. What story of the unexplained has stayed with you? Share your thoughts below. And remember to subscribe for more compelling mysteries that explore the enigma of those who were last seen and the families who never stopped hoping.